Shalom again from the Sephardic Educational Center in the Old City of Jerusalem. It's a pleasure to be with you once again from Israel. And appropriately, the previous class that I delivered from this same seat was about a very prominent rabbinical figure here in Israel, Rabbi Benny Lau. And appropriately, I'll conclude this series and this class by taking the time today to speak to you and to teach and expose you to somebody who we spoke about earlier in the semester, who also was a very, very prominent figure here in Israel. Continues his shadow continues to loom large over all writers here in Israel and lovers of literature and courses of literature, and that is Israel's very first Nobel Prize winner, and still to this date, despite that Israel has won, I believe, 10 Nobel Prizes, he is the only author, the only writer to have won a Nobel Prize in literature, Israeli author, that is, and his name was S.Y Agnon. I'm going to say a few words in general about Agnon, and then I'll lead us to some resources that I've emailed to you, materials that I'll talk about that will serve your needs in terms of a guide on how to study Agnon, because Agnon is quite complicated in terms of reading the material and understanding the material. And for those who are going to read it not in the original Hebrew, it's even that more challenging. Even though Agnon's Hebrew was quite difficult, it was not a modern Hebrew. Agnon wrote in biblical, Mishnaic, Talmudic, and Zoharic Hebrew, using phrases lifted straight out of the Tanakh, the Bible, out of the Mishnah, out of the Tosefta, out of the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, out of the Rambam. From these phrases, he composed his short stories and his novellas and his novels. But let me speak to you first a little bit about the background, the person, a little bit of biography, important to know, as it relates, of course, to his style and his genre of writing. So S.Y Agnon was born in a small village in Poland named Bochach. He was born in 1888, and he was not born S.Y Agnon. It was actually S.Y is Shin Yud is a Rashi Tevot. It's an acronym for Shmuel Yosef, and his last name was not Agnon, it was Chachkes. So Shmuel Yosef Chachkes eventually became S.Y Agnon. How did that happen? So first of all, he grew up in a traditional Jewish little village, little city, small town. Grew up in an interesting family, which was kind of unique. A lot of people talk about Sfaradim marrying Ashkenazim. In the state of Israel, that became like a big deal, like kind of an intermarriage between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. But it's not as if the Ashkenazi Jews didn't have their own intra-marriage problems amongst Jews. So we know that one of the most famous polemical battles amongst Ashkenazim is what we call the Hasidim versus the Misnagdim, the Hasidic Jews versus their Lithuanian Talmudic opponents, the Mitnagdim. So, the Hasidic Jews being students of the Baal Shem Tov, Mitnagdim being students of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon. They had a lot more animosity and hatred amongst them than Sfaradim or Ashkenazim ever did here in Israel. And despite that, interestingly, S.Y Agnon comes from a marriage where one parent was from the Hasidic tradition and one from the Mitnagdic tradition. So that was something of a little bit of a different upbringing. He did not have a formal education. He was raised in a cheder for a little while and then mostly had private tutors, had a mass knowledge of rabbinic literature. You see all these books behind me. He knew all of this and then some. Had a deep rabbinic education, came from a line of rabbis in his family, and was a Talmid Chacham, a rabbinic scholar from quite a young age. But he also took an interest, as per the times, in modern literature. And he read poems, poetry, literature, and translation. Then he decided to make his way. We're not going to spend a lot of time on his biography, but again, only as it relates to his writing. He made his way to Palestine, to Eretz Israel, 1908. In 1908, when he came to Israel, pre-state of Israel, of course, he was part of the milieu of the second Aliyah. This is the most famous Aliyah, which included some of the most prominent Zionist figures. It's essentially during the second Aliyah that the state of Israel was shaped in terms of its political institutions, its cultural institutions. That was really the shaping of what led the way in 1948 to the Declaration of Israel. Agnon was part of that. But he came only for 4 years in the beginning. He left in 1912. He came in 1908. He wanted to come and live in the new Israel, which was the old city of Jaffa and the newly emerging city of Tel Aviv. And he immediately immersed himself into the world of writers and literature. In 1908, he published his very first story. His very first story that he published, he took a pen name, which was Agnon. The reason why he took that name is because the first story that he published is a story called Agunot. And from the story Agunot, he took his, what we call nom de plume, his pen name, Agnon, and he signed that story Shin Yud Agnon, Shai Agnon, and Shai Agnon became the name, became the person, eventually became the legend, if you will. Why did he use that name? And let's talk a little bit about the story Agunot. We're not going to read any stories during this session, but there are stories that I'm going to strongly suggest you read on your own. And with the help of what I've emailed you, which are some guides to Agnon's specific stories, you'll be able to really, I think, immerse yourselves into reading one of the finest writers of the 20th century, Jewish or not Jewish, Israeli or not, Nobel Prize winner. Not all Nobel Prize winners are considered necessarily great writers. Some people, it's always controversial, but Agnon was really a very unique writer. The story Agunot really tells you everything you need to know about Shai Agnon, the writer, and Shai Agnon, the person. When he came in 1908, one of the things he decided to do in trying to join the new genre of writers, modern Hebrew literature, when he came and wanted to be part of the new Yishuv in the new Israel. So he took his kippah off and he abandoned religion for a little while. Was always connected to religion through his writing. Because, as I mentioned, his literature certainly did not have a secular feel to it in terms of its language. The language is like a page of Talmud in its Hebrew original. The language speaks a biblical Talmudic Hebrew. A lot of Israelis, because he merged, biblical Hebrew is one thing, Talmudic and Mishnaic and Zoharic is Aramaic, but with Hebrew it's something else. He mixed all of that together, and a lot of Israelis call that, they don't call it Ivrit, they call it Agnonit. It's Agnon's invented language that he mastered. And it's real masterpiece writing. It's brilliant and ingenious in terms of the intertextual connections that he makes between plot, narrative, original source. If you look at the Talmud and then you look at what he's done with the source in the story, it's really very unique. But Agnon, like all other writers of modern Hebrew literature, was exploring a new idea. In the Bible and in the The Hebrew language was a language of law, of halakha. The Hebrew language was a language of prayer in the Bet Knesset, and the Hebrew language was a language of study in the Bet Midrash. The Hebrew language was not the language of narrative, of stories, of plots, of love, of romance, of feelings. That was not the Hebrew language that was predominant. The Hebrew language was Lashon HaKodesh, the sacred language. So how do you take the sacred language and speak in terms of people's feelings, emotions, relationships, novelists that want to explore the human condition? That's what Agnon was trying to do. He wasn't a rabbi. He had more knowledge than most rabbis, but he did not claim to be a preacher or a rabbi. He claimed he was a writer who was exploring the human condition. The example of that is the story Agunot. Let's talk for a moment about what the word aguna means. We've all heard of it in halakha. The term aguna is, unfortunately, there was recently a very famous film here in Israel called Get, about a woman trying to get a divorce. And we know that there's an unfortunate loophole that's taking place in halakha, where if a woman is unhappy in her marriage, she feels emotionally or physically abused, she does not want to be married to her husband any longer. In strict Orthodox halakha, unless he is willing to grant her a get, she cannot come out of this marriage. And she is therefore, in halachic language, called an aguna. The word ogen means anchor. It means she's anchored. Now, the original aguna was not the recalcitrant husband who refuses to give the divorce. The original aguna was the situation of somebody, the man is at war, and he's missing in action. And the woman has no idea if her husband is alive or dead. His whereabouts are unknown. He's not even a declared prisoner of war. Just don't know where he is. And the situation goes on for a period of time. She's an aguna. She is anchored because she's still married to him. He can't come and give her the divorce. And as a result, she's stuck. She's in a state of limbo. Her heart is out somewhere. Her heart is not here. It's with her husband who's somewhere else. Yet she's stuck here in this place and cannot move on in her life. Agnon, in a stroke of genius, took the idea called agunot and transferred it from a halachic status to an emotional state of being. And he said, one can also argue that if I'm currently working as a lawyer because I was forced to work as a lawyer, because that's what my parents told me I have to do, and that's the situation that I'm in, and I'm locked in now, I can't get out of that. But I really want to be a singer. My heart is really with something else, but I'm stuck in this job. Agnon will argue that such a person is anchored. He's an aguna. Agnon will also argue, more classically to the relationships, that if a marriage was arranged, if there was a matchmaker, a shadchan, and A is matched to marry B, but A is really in love with C out there. But in the meanwhile, it's forced to marry this person. That's an aguna, an emotional aguna. And so Agnon's story, magically, is a whole series of plot twists about igun, the story agunot. And there are no agunot halachically in the story. None. Except for at the end. I don't want to ruin it for you. You should read the story. I hope I taunted you to read the story. There are no classic agunot of halacha, the woman and the husband and so on, until the end of the story. Throughout, there are new interpretive agunot, Agnon's style of agunot. Now, why did Agnon take that name for himself? One, because it's the first story he wrote, so it made sense. It was his pen name, became a famous story. But there is a deeper meaning to that beyond. And that is that Agnon, as somebody who was living here in Israel, never felt fully at peace with the fact that he didn't continue to live in Europe, which was true, by the way, for many of the Jews who felt that they had to come here. They were Zionists yet, yes, but look at the Zionism they tried to create in the early Aliyah. They tried to recreate Europe here. They loved Europe, and they felt very, very upset that they had to leave European civilization and European society. When Agnon made Aliyah in 1908, 4 years later, he left. And where did he go? To Germany, where he lived for 12 years until he came back in 1924. There was, for the European Jews who were Zionists, a deep, deep love of the diaspora, of Europe. And they felt uprooted from their natural environment into a new place, the Middle East. Some of them weren't able to cope with the change. It depressed them. If you want to read more about that, you should read Amos Oz's book, A Tale of Love and Darkness, where he talks about his mother's depression and eventual suicide. Her depression and suicide were based on disillusionment with what she found here, and that she really felt uprooted from her natural environment in Europe to this new jungle in the Middle East called Zionism, the State of Israel, all the big ideas. But in the end, people feel a sense of belonging to where they grew up. And Agnon felt that throughout his life. He was never really from here. You know, they call him the first Israeli to win a Nobel Prize. It's true. He lived in Israel most of his life. But if you asked Agnon himself, are you Israeli? He'd say, sort of. They just now changed it recently, but for a long time, the 50 shekel bill in Israel was Agnon on the 50 shekel bill. And somebody once said, it's very symbolic that Agnon was on the 50 shekel bill and not the 100 shekel bill. 50 is like half of 100, because he was his heart was always halfway here and half back home. As a matter of fact, in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, there's a very, very famous quote that Israelis love to quote, where Agnon gets up and he says, due to the catastrophe of the destruction of the Second Temple by the Roman Emperor Titus and the exiling of my people from the land of Israel, because of that, I happened to be born in a city in the diaspora. That's how he presented himself. He said, why was I born in Poland? Why was I born in the diaspora? Not because I really belonged there, but because Titus, the emperor, expelled my people from their land. Otherwise, we should all be born in Israel. So he said, due to the catastrophe of the destruction of the Second Temple and the exile of my people from their land by Titus, the Roman emperor, because of that, I happened to be born in a city in the diaspora. But I always saw myself as somebody who's from Jerusalem. Amos Oz once said that had Agnon got up and said, due to the catastrophe of the destruction of Eastern European Jewry during the Holocaust, I managed to escape and ended up a writer in Jerusalem. But I always saw myself as somebody who should have been a great rabbi in Europe. That would have been just as accurate. That would have been just as much Agnon. Because as much as he was proud to be a writer from Jerusalem, he had a tremendous nostalgia for the rabbis of Europe. Not only for the rabbis, but for the whole way of life. Now, Agnon was a complex figure. Some of his themes include the Zionist project, the transfer from the traditional world to the modern world. Agnon's genre of literature is categorized by literary critics as one of the modernists. T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, S.Y Agnon are often spoken in the same breath as doing the same thing in their literature, largely dealing with the breakdown, the nostalgia, the nightmare of leaving the old traditional world to this new unknown world at the turn of the century. For the Jews, that happened to be leaving the nostalgia of your old little village in Poland, the nightmare of the pogroms and eventually the gas chambers, and the unknown world of this new big idea called Zionism, which on paper and during a speech sounds amazing. But to actually come and live here and to create that was something altogether different, easier said than done. If you want to read Agnon's full-blown exploration of that theme, so one of his most famous novels, I brought it here in Hebrew, but it is available in English, is called Tmol Shilshom. And you see on this edition here, this is the newer edition of books that Israelis are very proud to print and put the gold stamp of Nobel Prize in Literature. This is one of Agnon's very famous novels. In English, it's been translated as Only Yesterday. I will send you a link by email, and it's a book available in English on Amazon. It's the story of the second Aliyah, and many Israelis would say, if you want to read a fantasy view of what it was like here during the rise of the State of Israel, then read the book or watch the movie Exodus. If you want to really see what it was like here during the beginning of before the State of Israel, read Agnon's Tmol Shilshom. It's the difference between the fantasy of Zionism and the harsh realities of what people had to face here in a new place that was yet to be developed, with all sorts of complexities. Jews coming from all over the place, speaking different languages, having different ideas about what Israel is going to be. Is it going to be socialist? Is it going to be capitalist? Is it going to be left? Is it going to be right? The religious community, the old religious community that lived here, economically, how does somebody survive? And of course, what do you do with a few 100,000 people living here called Arabs? Who are they? Do they belong here? Do we belong here with them? All of those things are kind of glossed over when you watch Exodus, because with Exodus, it's the feel-good movie about Zionism, and every Zionist looked like Paul Newman, Aryeh Ben Canaan, and it all looks beautiful, and it's very moving with Otto Preminger's score, and it's a wonderful thing. Agnon is a realist and tells the story. And of course, the relationships that somebody endures, trying to get married, trying to find your loved one, trying to find your place in a society, very awkward situations. The whole new idea of the fact that, your boss is a Jew. Who's building the country? Jews, Arab workers. I thought Zionism means Hebrew labor. We don't want Arab workers. All this is explored here in this novel. So Agnon's themes include some of those big picture themes, but he also has a string of novels that have nothing to do with the big picture, but have everything to do with relationships, with romance, with breakdown, bereavement, love affairs, adulterous affairs. And Agnon writes all of this in that very unique biblical, Talmudic, midrashic, linguistic style of his. So that's an important point for me to continue to emphasize, because the moment you read Agnon in translation, which I suspect some of you will read it more likely in English than in Hebrew, although I would strongly encourage you to try reading it in Hebrew. The the moment you read Agnon in English, the word plays and the word associations and the connection to all the texts kind of goes away. The themes remain. The themes are no less powerful and impactful. It's just some of the plays on word, the intertextuality that he uses, go away. Now, before I go into the sources that I want to look at that I've emailed you on the computer, I want to talk a little bit about why I would include this in this class. And I'll tell you very interestingly, from the very seat where I'm sitting, here in this Bet Midrash, today is Wednesday, right? A week from today, which is actually the day I'm leaving, I'm giving my final shiur for this trip to the rabbis who are usually sitting right around this table that we study with. And I'm going to be speaking about the very same subject to them, prepared a lecture about S.Y Agnon. Now, this is a group of rabbis who, some of them in high school, may have studied S.Y Agnon. So to them, it's the equivalent of somebody coming and saying, I think as rabbis, you should have Shakespeare as part of your teaching, because Agnon is Israel's Shakespeare. And a lot of people, when they think of Agnon, automatically they think of their Bagrut exams, their high school finals, and they go, oh, I don't want to read that. Oh my God, are you kidding? Anything but that. You know, they have nightmares from it. Later on, people start to appreciate what he was doing. There's kind of a revival in Israel about Agnon. There's a lot of his short stories becoming plays. Somebody wrote like an Agnon musical type thing that's playing in Tel Aviv. So there's a lot of renewed interest in it because he's a cultural icon. Every city has a Agnon street, an Agnon school. And of course, some of you may have visited already, but if not, I would encourage you that the next time you're in Israel, you make your way to a neighborhood called Talpiot in Jerusalem and ask for the Agnon house. It's on 16 Klausner Street. His house is, as it was, where he lived. It's today a national monument in Israel. It belongs to the municipality, to the city of Jerusalem. And his entire library is there, as are his furnishings. It's a beautiful little home, 2 stories. The bottom story is where they lived. The top story was the Holy of Holies. It was his study. That's where he wrote. And his entire library is there, and you could visit. Today, it's not only a place that tourists come, but there's also many literary events there, poetry readings, readings of Agnon's novels, of course, and of others. It's kind of a destination for writers, students of literature, emerging writers, lovers of Agnon, what have you. So Agnon, because he is a cultural icon in Israel, that kind of aura about him continues to fascinate. So I want to tell you now about the actual sources that I provided for you. There are 2 that I provided for you by email. One is a collection of articles, and the other is a study guide to Agnon's stories. Let me talk to you a little bit about where those 2 brochures that I emailed to you as PDFs, how they developed, what are they, what specific material. So when I was a community rabbi, when I was a pulpit rabbi in Los Angeles, I was on the executive committee of the board of rabbis, and we had a program every year. I don't think it exists anymore in Los Angeles. It was a wonderful initiative called One People, One Book. And the idea basically was to create a big Jewish book club in Los Angeles, community-wide, where synagogues from all denominations all across Southern California were all going to adopt one book that they would read. And we would provide some materials. There was a One People, One Book committee on the Board of Rabbis that would adopt the book and then sit down and prepare lesson plans, study guides that we would provide for the group facilitators in the different synagogues. Each synagogue would do the book club their own way, and we had one big grand opening event somewhere where we like kicked off the One People, One Book with literary reading, a kickoff related or thematically related to the book itself. And then throughout the year, every synagogue did the book club their own way, along with using, of course, the materials that we provided as facilitated, breakdown of the stories into themes, questions, suggested discussion topics, etc., typical book stuff materials. And then we also had a closing event at the end of the year, sometime in May or June, kind of like to wrap up. So when it was coming across Israel's 60th anniversary, we were thinking about doing something for One People, One Book. We decided it would be appropriate to adopt an Israeli writer. So I, of course, being passionate about Agnon, suggested that we read S.Y Agnon. So I was kind of overwhelmingly shocked to hear that there were some rabbis, colleagues, names not to be named, who did not know who he was, had never heard of him. That was a little bit shocking to me. And then somebody asked me, did Agnon write novels or short stories? So I said, well, if you go to the bookstore today in Hebrew and you buy the set of Agnon, it's 23 volumes of material. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of short stories. He also wrote 9 novels and novellas. So yes, he's written a little bit. We decided to not read a novel because sometimes that intimidates people because Agnon's novels are quite long. We decided to use a collection of short stories, translated into English, of course. So I've also sent you a link to those books that I would suggest you buy and incorporate and make part of your library. The original collection of short stories in English, translated into English, of Agnon is a book titled 21 Stories. It has a red cover. It's the famous 21 Stories of Agnon. I mean, he wrote many more than 21 stories, but this, when you an editor decides what are going to be the top 10 or 20 stories, in this case 21. So you're always going to say, how'd they leave this out and that out? But there are 21 excellent stories. Afterwards, a newer collection of stories came out called A Book That Was Lost. A Book That Was Lost is the title of an Agnon story, and that story is included in the collection called A Book That Was Lost. These are all published by Schocken Press, S-C-H-O-C-K-E-N. The reason being, and that's who publishes it in Hebrew as well, Tfus Schocken. The reason being is because how did Agnon make his living? So there was a very famous businessman who discovered Agnon in Germany. His name is Zalman Schocken. He eventually became the founder of Schocken Press. He also published Haaretz, the newspaper, and he was enamored with Agnon's stories. And it was Zalman Schocken who basically gave Agnon his living. He was Agnon's patron. He supported Agnon his entire life, wanted to make sure that Agnon never had to worry about money and never had to make sure about earning a living, and he could just sit and write and produce. And it was Zalman Schocken who eventually was able to, you always have to pull strings, but it was Zalman Schocken who wrote the letter together with a few others who suggested Agnon be a candidate for the Nobel Prize, which he eventually won in 1966. So Schocken published a collection of the short stories called The Book That Was Lost. Now there's a new publishing house called Toby Press, T-O-B-Y. They are experts in modern Hebrew literature, in translation, in English translation. They've published an expanded version of A Book That Was Lost to include some of the stories that were in 21 Stories, plus that. Any of those collections, 21 Stories, is out of print, but you could find it used on Amazon, or A Book That Was Lost, either the one by Schocken, which has like kind of a light blue, baby blue cover, or the new Book That Was Lost by Toby Press, which is like a larger, more white cover. Any of those would be excellent books to own, with a fantastic sampling of the best of Agnon's short stories. His novels which we did not deal with in the material that I sent you, but I'll just tell you a little bit about some of his novels. I told you about Tmol Shel Shom only yesterday. The novel that probably got him noticed for the Nobel Prize around the world was a novel that really spoke to a lot of people. The title of the novel in Hebrew is Oreach Natal Alun, which means a guest for the night. Did Agnon ever go home after he came back to Israel? So the answer is yes. After he resettled in Israel in 1924, he did make one trip back to Bochach, his hometown, between World War I and World War II. He was there for a total of 5 days. And based on that trip and what he saw going on in Europe, and what he saw the writing on the wall and what was happening in terms of anti-Semitism, etc., he came back to Israel and wrote a novel that he published. The novel is called The Guest for the Night. And the novel actually takes place between World War I and World War II. It's largely based on what he saw, and he composed a very, very creative, fascinating novel. And the novel, many people read that novel and felt that it was almost Agnon predicting the Holocaust, even though he was not that kind of person at all, and he wasn't claiming in some kind of mystical or prophetic or preaching sense to predict the Holocaust. But many people read the novel and said it looks like, the writing is on the wall type of a novel. And Agnon published A Guest for the Night in 1939, believe it or not, right at the outbreak of World War II. So this was not a novel that he wrote after the Holocaust. Agnon never wrote about the Holocaust. He did not go through the Holocaust. He was in Palestine throughout the time of the Holocaust. So there is no Elie Wiesel type of writing in Agnon where you're talking about the Holocaust, full on like night, or the type of Elie Wiesel literature, or the other things we're used to. Agnon touched upon themes of the destruction of Eastern European Jewry, most definitely. But as somebody who did not survive the camps and was not in the camps, there's no Holocaust literature in Agnon. Now, A Guest for the Night is a fascinating novel, Tmol Shel Shom as well. And I'm going from subject to subject, but I want you to also be aware of one other major theme in Agnon. And that is, in addition to the Jewish part of Agnon, in addition to the Jewish language, in addition to the themes about Zionism, etc., there were also two major themes that occupied, actually I would say three major universalist themes that occupied Agnon in his writing. One is the very act, the creative act of writing. Agnon was in love with writing, and many of his stories deal with the creative act of writing and the frustrated writer and the frustration that a writer sometimes feels. These are universal themes across the board for many writers. This has nothing to do with being Jewish. Agnon actually I'll give you an example of how he used the terms of modern Hebrew literature and traditional rabbinic literature in a story. He wrote a story called The Tale of the Scribe, A Tale of the Scribe. Now in Hebrew, in rabbinic Hebrew, how do we say scribe? Like a scribe who writes a Sefer Torah? A sofer. In modern Hebrew, what is the term for an author, like Amos Oz or Agnon? Not somebody who's writing Torah scrolls, but who's writing books. What's the title of that? Sofer. So Agnon explored in many of his stories the transferring of going from being a sofer to a sofer. And the difference between a sofer and a sofer is not only religious versus secular literature. It's not only Torah scroll versus secular knowledge. It's that a sofer, when he's writing a Torah scroll, must follow rules, has no creativity. He can't say, I don't really like the ending of the flood. I'm going to change the story a little bit. He can't say, I don't like the font. I don't like where this letter is placed. Right? He has to follow rules. A sofer, a modern one, is completely the opposite. And that fascinated Agnon. And he always wanted to see himself as, on one hand, a continuity with his Jewish past, but at the same time, a radical break with it, because he's taking the letters from the past and regrouping them into completely new experiences. So I would say the creative act of writing is a big theme in Agnon. The second theme is being an artist. Want to know something very interesting about Agnon? So if you imagine his study, you'd imagine that upstairs in his study he had a desk and a chair and a typewriter and his pen and paper, and he sat and wrote. Agnon did not sit and write. Agnon stood 14 to 16 hours a day at a podium like this, and he stood and wrote. He did not sit at his desk and write. Now, there's two reasons for that, and they're fascinating. The Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, that the ancient Sofrim, the ancient scribes, when they wrote scrolls, did so standing, not sitting. Why? Because you don't sit in the presence of a Torah scroll. You stand when a Torah scroll. So because the act was considered an act of sanctity, when you're writing a Torah scroll, today many of them may sit, but the original minhag, the original custom during the days of the Second Temple, the Mishnah and the Talmud, was that a sofer, a scribe, stood at a lectern and wrote. So Agnon did that because he saw himself as a continuation of Sofrim, but there was something else to it. Stop and take the image of somebody standing, of the artist with the artistic writer, the creator, the sofer who's creating. And he has a piece of paper and he has a pen. And to Agnon, when he actually stood at the lectern and he had his piece of paper and the pen and he was writing, he saw his piece of paper as an easel and his pen as a brush. And he was the artist that was painting, that was creating through the same letters that the sofer had to follow the rules. Here, he didn't have to follow the rules, and he was creating new landscapes of literature, stories, plots, characters, intrigue, intricacies, complexities, that on a day-to-day basis, he viewed himself as an artist. And Agnon, as the artist, was a very, very big part of his writing and many of his themes. The new artist in the new land. This could be anywhere in the world. For him, his setting happened to be Eretz Yisrael, but it could have been anywhere. The third theme that occupies Agnon a lot is relationships. As we say in Hebrew, beno lebena, between him and her. Relationships between human beings. The human relationship, exploring the feeling of fulfillment or lack thereof, being married and being fulfilled or not, the constant attraction to others, all of the deep, dark complexities that are considered taboo, Agnon explored. There's a reason for this, by the way, because Agnon was deeply influenced by people that were very prominent in his time, such as Freud. Deeply influenced Agnon and the themes. Agnon was very close, by the way, also to Martin Buber. He was very close to Gershom Scholem, the Kabbalist, and Agnon had a very deep, deep connection to Kabbalah and mysticism. There's an entire work written exploring Kabbalistic and mystical writings in Agnon's stories. So with all of that, let me get back just to give you a little guidance on the brochures that I mailed you. When we decided to on the 60th anniversary of the State of Israel, when the Board of Rabbis of Los Angeles, of Southern California, decided to do the One People, One Book on S.Y Agnon. So I was the co-editor of the 2 volumes, and we gathered a group of rabbis and intellectuals to write 2 separate documents. One which contains several articles, kind of overviews on Agnon. It's a wonderful resource for you. It includes articles on Agnon's genre as a writer, Agnon as a Jewish writer. I wrote 2 pieces in there, one on Agnon's theology. That's another very big theme, is Agnon, was he a believer? Was he a doubter? People were never clear. Here's a man with a kippah on his head, but the literature did not seem religious. It seemed very doubtful of God. His characters are always arguing with God. So that was a lot of him coming out into his characters. Was he a believer or a doubter? Was he a Zionist? For Agnon, Israel was, as the title of my article in that collection, on one hand it was a holy land, but at the same time it was a homeland. And for him, a homeland didn't mean nationalism. Homeland simply meant, this is where we live. This is where we go shopping at the market. This is where we raise children. This is where our kids go to school. That's what homeland meant. And to Agnon, if somebody is fighting in the army, it's not necessarily because they're defending the flag. It's because they're defending their backyard. They're defending their basketball court. They're defending their best friend. It's not, Agnon was not draped in a flag of Zionism. He was a Zionist, a believer in Israel, but this is not nationalist writing about the land. On the contrary, it's about a homeland, meaning this is where we live. And everywhere we live is complicated and complex. There's no utopia. This is not the Garden of Eden. It's Zionism, it's Jewish, it's amazing, but it's filled with problems, and Agnon was not afraid to explore those themes. So you'll find articles on that in that collection, on all of these themes, Agnon as the artist, etc. And then in the other collection, which is a study guide to 9 stories, that study guide will give you lesson plans to use. I want to conclude this by impressing upon you, much like I will next week to the rabbis sitting around the table here, why I think Agnon should be part of rabbinic teachings. You take, for example, this book over here. This is a collection of articles about Rabbi Soloveitchik. Much like we have articles by Rabbi Soloveitchik, we have articles by Heschel, Heschel's God in Search of Man, Man is Not Alone. The problem with all of that, in my opinion, is that it's wonderful for the intellectual audience who wants to sit and contemplate and read Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, or read Halachic Man by Rav Soloveitchik, God in Search of Man by Heschel, I and Thou by Buber. The common denominator between all of those is it's abstract. And communities, whether you're the rabbi of a synagogue, whether you're teaching a group of teenagers, an adult education class, a lot of them are not abstract thinkers. A lot of them are not attracted to the abstract genres of philosophers, what we call our great Jewish minds and thinkers. A lot of them would rather, if you tell them a story, if you say, let's sit down and read a story together. The Hasidic masters became legends. The Baal Shem Tov became a legend because of his stories. By the way, one of Agnon's volumes in Hebrew is called Sipurei Habesh, Stories of the Baal Shem Tov. He was deeply connected to the Hasidic tradition due to his lineage, and also as a storyteller. He felt a natural alliance with the storytellers of the Hasidic world. So Agnon as a storyteller, but as a storyteller whose stories have messages, is the Agnon that I want you to connect with, is the Agnon that I think you must incorporate into your teachings as rabbis, because congregants like to read a story and then discuss it. And sometimes Agnon has a story that's a page long, and in one page he'll explore ideas that turn Jewish tradition upside down. And it's not only a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a story that you sit and explore for its depth, for its themes, for what it says about the human condition. And that's why Agnon, a writer who was born in Poland and spent most of his life in Israel and wrote in the most dense biblical Talmudic Hebrew, has been translated into 35 languages. Agnon is read in Arabic. Agnon is read in Chinese and Japanese. Agnon's literature has gone all over the world because, yes, maybe the moment you translate it from its original, a lot of those word plays are gone. But the themes of an artist, the themes of human relationships, the theme of the human condition, the theme of being uprooted from your homeland to a new place, of being an immigrant, isn't that relevant today? It captures our attention as one of the most important issues in our world today. So the characters could be Agnon's characters because every writer has his or her setting. But it would be a big mistake to understand this as Jewish literature. It's universalist literature dressed in Judaism. And many of our congregants are looking for universal themes. And it's beautiful, I think, to take universal themes like Agnon deals with and to explore them by a Jewish writer who won a Nobel Prize in Israel, whose language of Judaism is familiar to our congregants, that throws light on many of the Jewish issues that we want to engage with. So here's what I suggest. The study guides are available for you by email. They are self-explanatory. They are study guides that you could make use of. They're ready to be used as a curriculum for adult education, exactly like it worked for 25 or 30 communities or however many did it that year. It can continue to work today. A book that was lost is a book that you could acquire on Amazon or used bookstores. The novels are, like I said, not covered in the study guides, but they're discussed in some of my articles in the collection of articles. And Agnon as a storyteller is something that I know beyond the One People, One Book club that we had. Agnon as a storyteller is something that I've used as triggers for sermons. At the very beginning, I've used excerpts from Agnon's stories because, as I'm sure you've studied in your other classes, if you begin a sermon with an abstract idea, it's going to remain abstract. But if you begin a sermon with a story, if you end the sermon with a story, that story is going to stick with your congregants. Agnon's stories touch the heart because he was a poet and he was somebody who was not afraid to explore the depth of complex issues. This is not a simplistic storyteller at all, a very, very deep thinker. And there are some who would argue that Agnon himself, he would have never said so. He would have said, absolutely not. Can Agnon be considered Jewish thought? I would argue yes. I would argue that when you read Agnon's stories with Jewish lenses, and if you remove for a moment the literary criticism and the universalism, and you say, okay, what is he saying about the Jewish community? What is he saying about Zionism? What is he saying about the Jewish condition? What is he saying about the land of Israel? Okay, in those situations, the ironies of Agnon, his biting criticism of issues, these things apply as much today in the year 2016 as they did back when he wrote them in the 1930s, 40s. Agnon won the Nobel Prize in 1966, died 4 years later in 1970, buried here in Jerusalem just outside of the Sephardic Educational Center. You can look and see that big beautiful mountain with the cemetery on it, Har HaZeitim, Mount of Olives, that's where he's buried. Agnon had 2 children. His son really did not continue anything connected to his writing, kind of distanced himself from everything, kind of had a complicated relationship with his father, did not travel to Stockholm with his parents when they won the Nobel Prize, but later in life kind of reconciled with everything. Agnon's daughter, who just died about a year ago, Emuna Yaron, she was her father's daughter. She herself was a budding writer, and when Agnon died, there were 8 volumes of his literature that were published. That was the classic canonical Agnon. There were 8. But he left a lot more that had not been published, manuscripts. Of course, every university wanted to get their hands on those manuscripts. Those would all become, fertile ground for doctoral students in Hebrew literature to do their PhDs. Emuna Yaron and Agnon, in his will to her, would have none of it, and she had the exclusive rights over all those manuscripts, and she spent the rest of her life devoted to her father's work. And after he died, she published an additional 15 volumes of Agnon's unpublished works, novels, short stories, letters, etc., etc. So this was Agnon's family. His legacy continues through his writing. It's not something that's commonly part of rabbinic discourse. A lot of people say, rabbis are going to study Bible, Talmud, Jewish law, Jewish philosophy, literature, that's for literary critics. I vehemently disagree. I think literature is a fantastic vehicle for conversations and discussions with our congregants, with our communities, with our students. And I certainly think Agnon, as a writer, has much to say to the Jewish world today, which is why I continue to write about him. It's why I continue to teach about him. Please God, in the future, like I've done in the past at AJR, I've taught entire classes on Agnon for a full semester, where we actually read the stories in depth, break them down. At the beginning of this semester, I mentioned to you that Agnon also put together, as we had seen, anthologies on the high holidays, the days of awe, Yamim Noraim, all about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. He also put together other anthologies that dealt with the giving of the Torah. One is called Present at Sinai. In Hebrew, it's called Atem Re'item. Jewish Publication Society published Present at Sinai, which is an abridged version of Atem Re'item, translated into English. Again, a whole collection of sources on the giving of the Torah. So these, and I mentioned to you the Baal Shem Tov. Not all of Agnon has been translated into English. All of his famous novels. If you go on the Toby Press website, you'll see many new translations of things that have never been translated before, as well as reissues or revised translations of Guest for the Night and other novels. But I would start with a book that was lost, the stories, the study guides that I've provided. If you Google Agnon, you'll find thousands of articles, so it may be overwhelming. So I would start with the material that I gave you. I think you'd be in good hands with that. I could say so personally. It worked for a lot of communities when they used it, and it was very, very successful. And they've been posted in many, many different places on the internet because they were pretty high quality materials that we were able to, we set the bar high to make sure that what was written there would really fit to the standards of literature, of understanding of the literature. But of course, as rabbis, we wrote it with a Jewish twist, with the idea that this perfectly applies to communities, high school students, college students, young adults, adult education, sermonic material. Using some of this, I've used some of Agnon's, snippets of Agnon's writings when I've given eulogies in cemeteries. I mean, you could really find various places where it could be done. So I encourage you to go out and read Agunot, the story, read some of the Agnon stories. Read the ones that I provided here in the study guides, and you'll really find yourself in a place where you'll have a whole world of Jewish literature, of literature in general, and of a genius writer opened up to you. And I wish you the best of luck in using it to open up your congregants' minds to thinking, using literature as a way of exploring big ideas. So with that, I'm going to sign off from Jerusalem, sitting here about 10-minute drive from where Agnon lived, a couple minutes from where Agnon was laid to rest, from Jerusalem to wherever you are in Los Angeles or wherever you may be. Wish you God bless you and blessings, and hope for peace here in Israel. It's been a difficult time here recently, so we hope and pray for better times. In the meanwhile, have a cup of coffee and enjoy Agnon. If you're ever, I'll give one commercial to a place. Some of you may have been here. If you've ever been to in Jerusalem, in the center of town, there is a fantastic, my favorite cafe in the world. It's a literary cafe called Tmol Shilshom, which is the title of this novel, and it's a beautiful literary cafe, all in Agnon themes. The menus have covers of Agnon's books, and they have something there called a chai latte instead of chai latte. It's very cute. So enjoy. If you come to Jerusalem, certainly look up Tmol Shilshom as a great place to sit and read and have fantastic coffee. With that, we'll see you back in Los Angeles at AJR next semester. God bless you, shalom, and enjoy. Bye-bye.